Welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of the series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In this event, Major Joshua Lehman will discuss the ethical challenges of drone warfare. I'm particularly excited to have him with us because of the unique perspective he brings to this topic, as he's both an instructor of philosophy at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he served throughout the Middle East as a Special Forces soldier. Before we introduce Major Lehman, I'll briefly describe our speaker series and tell you how you can participate. So Ethically Speaking, as you can see on our screen, is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who is Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time, and we encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics is increasingly identified as a cornerstone for professional training and development, and the importance of ethics at UCF should be clear from the long list of partners who co-sponsor this series. All of us in this partnership hope you enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. So today's presentation is being recorded, and we will post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. And at the end of our presentation, Major Lehman will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. You can submit your questions via chat to Dr. Beaver, and if we have time for your question, he will invite you to unmute and pose your question directly. Now our speaker will be introduced by Dr. Bruce Calkins from the UCF Institute for Simulation and Training. Dr. Calkins is director of the program for modeling and simulation of behavioral cybersecurity, where he trains students and conducts research in this rapidly evolving field. Dr. Calkins came to UCF after a distinguished career of 28 years serving in the Army himself. Dr. Calkins.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening. My name is Bruce Calkins. As he mentioned, I'm an associate professor working at the School of Modeling, Simulation, and Training here at UCF. I'm the director of the Modeling Simulation of Behavioral Cyber program, which is designed to educate professionals in the behavioral aspects of cybersecurity itself. As a retired Army officer, I'm particularly honored to introduce Major Promotable Joshua Lehman. Major Lehman is an Army Special Forces officer who graduated from West Point in 2005. He's currently a full-time instructor of English and philosophy at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His research interests include metaphysics, just war tradition, and strategic studies. His service with the Special Forces Group, 5th Special Forces at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, includes missions in Iraq, Syria, and other locations throughout the Middle East. So he's well qualified for what we're about to discuss today. His duty positions include command of a Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha, command of an Advanced Skills Company, and executive officer of 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group. He has amassed in the 16 years of service a great deal of experience and knowledge in the ethics of modern warfare. This discussion tonight is entitled "The Ethical Challenges of Drone Warfare. Is the Just War Tradition Obsolete?" Please give a warm welcome, virtual welcome, and your undivided attention to our guest speaker, Major Joshua Lehman.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Colonel Calkins, for that introduction, and Stephen for setting everything up. You and your whole team have been very gracious. So I'm coming to everybody from frigid West Point, New York on the Hudson River. where it's in the 20s right now, so it's pretty cold. And I'm excited to talk to you today about the ethics of war, how we might think about the ethics of war, and particularly the ethics of drone warfare. So my goal is fairly modest today. So if there's any graduate students out there who are more interested in a more in-depth discussion, I'd be happy to entertain it. But I think what you'll find today is a modest approach to presenting the just war tradition as a viable option, as a viable framework. In fact, what I think is the only moral framework for thinking about war. Okay, and then we'll look at it more particularly about how it applies to drone warfare. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing when we talk about the ethics of war, it's typically three positions or three schools of thought that scholars or thinkers about the ethics of war consider. There's pacifism and realism. Both of those we can talk about afterwards if anybody would like to raise a question, but in short, I think pacifism is frankly unrealistic, and realism admits of immoral acts, I think, but we can talk about that in the questions afterwards if anybody would like to. I mean, what remains here is the just war tradition. Okay, so I say just war tradition rather than just war theory, although there's a lot of scholars out there who use the term theory. I think we tend to do this, or contemporary scholars tend to do this, because theory implies a formulaic approach. That's what theories do. We have theories of evolution, quantum mechanical theories, chemistry theories that Stephen's well versed in. And the idea is to reduce a complex phenomenon to a formula that describes it. And I think that the complexity of war often doesn't lend itself to that kind of a tidy approach. So I think tradition is the better word. And there's other reasons for that too. I mean, tradition comes from the Latin tradare, to hand on, and the just war tradition has ancient roots. So it goes all the way back probably to Aristotle, is probably the earliest that we can think of, where Aristotle wrote in his Politics, book 7, that war must be for the sake of peace. Later, Cicero, in his work on duties, would spell out some of the principles that were the early germs of just war theory that grew over the course of history into greater sophistication as the West went through wars, right? So, just from Cicero, I'd like to point out, you'll find in his book 1 on duties, he says, quote, "No war is just unless it is entered upon after an official demand for satisfaction has been submitted, or a warning has been given and a formal declaration made." So already as early as Cicero, there's a concern about who has the authority to make war or declare war, and then what is the formal process of declaring war. This is important to do for it to be a war. Cicero says other things like, quote, "The man who is not legally a soldier has no right to be fighting the foe," end quote. So again, before the time of Christ, we're already making distinctions between who can fight, who can't fight, who's a combatant, and which germinates into who's a non-combatant, and those types of distinctions. But finally, I like to say about Cicero, one of the things that I find enduring about him, he has an insight. It's a touching insight into the humane treatment of enemies, where he endorses an ancient custom of calling the enemy a guest. He says that we should call our enemies guests. Why? Because when the war is over, we'll keep our promises that we made to them at the beginning. And while the war is happening, we'll treat them in humane ways. And so I think that's very touching, and it's at the heart of the tradition. Okay, so just, it is a tradition, so it did get handed down through the history of the West. There are many figures involved. I'll just mention a couple others. Augustine, who's writing at the time of the fall of Rome, was critical for coming up with a Christian Platonic Stoic synthesis that helped him account for how a soldier can engage in violence while also having an intention of peace. As the tradition gets handed down through the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, of course, introduces the doctrine of double effect, which is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial to the tradition. And that is that we can act, or an act is permissible. We can act in such a way that may cause an unintended consequence when those consequences are indeed not intended. Okay, so it's an important point that comes into how we think about collateral damage, especially in drones, with drones. Okay, and so just jumping all the way to the modern period, indeed the contemporary period, we have Michael Walzer and his touchstone 1977 work, Just and Unjust Wars. He takes the just war tradition into a secular modern key where he's thinking about rights and grounding the ideas of just war in rights. And then there's philosophers after him like Brian Arendt who are doing the same thing. And so a lot of scholars who are working in the tradition are looking at how rights play into just war. Okay, so enough about the tradition part, the just part. How does this tradition think about justice? Well, it really breaks down war predominantly into two categories. So there are more now, and I'll mention some, but the pillars of the tradition have been a distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Okay, jus ad bellum, it's Latin, it means going toward the war, right? The justice toward the war, which is basically the justice of the war as itself. Are we engaging in to go to war? Is this a just act? Do we have a just intention? Okay. Jus in bello is Latin and refers to the justice in the war. And once we have committed ourselves to hopefully a just war, now we have to think about all of the actions that we do inside of the context of that war and whether or not they are just. Okay, so when we look at these two categories of justice, if you will, the justice of going to war includes principles like intentions for peace, right? We heard that with Aristotle. Choosing war as a last resort, formal declaration by a competent state authority. Again, you see this as early as Cicero, but it gets handed down. And then jus in bello principles, three of the common ones. We talk about proportionality, so we want to use the minimum amount of force to achieve a result. And discrimination, we want to ensure that we don't kill non-combatants. And you're going to see these crop up when we talk about drones. More recently, scholars think about the rights of soldiers and upholding the rights of soldiers in war. Okay, so those are the two big categories, if you will. Now, there are more use. Postbellum, which means justice after the war, has become very prominent in the last couple decades. And that is, how do you end a war justly? How do you enforce a just peace? So that's a prominent contemporary field in just war tradition. Okay, so overall, what we have with just war is it assumes that war is going to happen, right? It doesn't think that humankind can achieve not a complete peace. I mean, and that seems to play out with the historical evidence. Despite our most sophisticated efforts, like the creation of the United Nations or its predecessor, the League of Nations, we still seem to have war. And the just war theory seeks to limit the suffering, keep it to an absolute minimum, and frame the entire effort under just principles. Okay, so much for just war tradition as a framework. So let's talk about drones. Before we talk theoretically about drones, I'd just like to introduce experientially what are we talking about when we say drone and drone warfare. Okay, so this is what it's like today. In the military, we call them unmanned aerial vehicles, or sometimes unmanned aerial systems. So the reference here is the fact they don't have a human person in them. And there's not just drones in the sky. We're developing unmanned tanks, unmanned submarines, unmanned infantrymen. So while we're thinking today mostly about unmanned aerial vehicles, it is good to understand that the breadth of drone technology is increasing. Okay, so this is what you get with an unmanned aerial vehicle. First of all, you have the remotely located pilot. The pilot is somewhere else. But you also have technicians that monitor all the sensors. So there's an entire team behind a drone. It's not simply a matter of switching a killer robot on, which is a different thing we'll talk about in a moment. And then the killer robot goes out and does its thing. Now, contemporary drone warfare is done by teams. You have a remote pilot, you have sensor technicians who are monitoring the sensory feeds and interpreting those feeds. You have military lawyers who are well-versed in all of the legalities that surround the use of drones. You have operations officers who fit the drone into the overall plan. And you have commanders who have the authority to strike, as we say, and that's to pull the trigger, right? So commanders have the authority to strike, and those commanders are the bearers of responsibility, which is an important point is to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay, and then undergirding all of this, you have complex decision-making matrices that consider proportionality and discrimination. So the deployment of drones is a fairly sophisticated operation. Okay, now I do want to make a distinction here that other philosophers make, and that is between the drones as I've just described them and the killer robot, right? Which is a theoretical construct, although who knows how soon this will be a reality. The killer robot is the completely autonomous system. The team is gone that I just described, and artificial intelligence replaces all of those people. And you switch the drone on and the drone goes out and conducts warfare. Okay, I think there's a different set of concerns that come with that. So I am going to make that distinction between the drone as we know it and the killer robot. Okay, so now that we have in mind what we're talking about when we talk about drones, I want to consider some of the ethical issues or concerns that arise with it. And here I'm following philosopher Daniel Statman. Okay, so I owe him the credit, in anything that I get wrong with his argument is my own fault. Okay, so one of the things Statman points out is that there seems to be quite a bit of vagary around what our actual concerns are with drones. We can't seem to pin exactly what it is that unsettles us about them. And he points out several concerns that I think are important to raise here. So one, somebody might object that, well, using a drone, it's disrespectful to a human being. It's disrespectful to a human being to be killed by a drone. And often I think what people have in mind here is the standoff. You know, the drone seems to appear out of nowhere, strikes a target and is gone. But this doesn't really account for the fact that a lot of our contemporary weapons use impersonal standoff. So the question is, how, in this case, is a drone any different from an attack helicopter or a cruise missile or any other form of modern weaponry that's designed around standoff? So another concern might be, well, killing by means of a drone is unfair. But again, here, I think this is a lot like the first concern, in that modern warfare is not interested in fairness. Modern warfare is interested in winning the war, winning the battle as fast as possible to limit casualties and to achieve the peace. So really, a concern about killing by means of a drone as being unfair seems to me to be the same concern early about disrespect for human beings, with the same reply that most modern weaponry does have this impersonal standoff. And I'd also add that contemporary Western military doctrine relies on projecting overwhelming force at the decisive point, we say. So it's in fact about not being fair. because that's how you win quickly. Okay, so maybe another concern is, well, drones just aren't virtuous. There's no virtue in when you're struck by a drone. There's something cowardly about it. Like there's no man on man, display of virtue. But here Statman reminds us that war is not for martial virtues. Martial virtues are for war. It's the other way around. War is for the peace, as Aristotle would tell us. So we don't go to war to win valor awards. We go to war to win and win the peace, and we want to do that quickly. So all three of those, I think we can dismiss. And in some ways, all three of those concerns, I think, reduce really to a pacifist position that weapons themselves are immoral. Okay, so what about killer robots then? Is it different if we use a killer robot and we send this killer robot out and it has artificial intelligence systems and does everything? Well, one of the things that Statman points out is that we don't seem to have problems with automated defense systems like Iron Domes. I know personally I was grateful when I was serving in Iraq for automated systems that intercepted incoming mortars. I think those are good things. So we don't seem to have a problem with that. So what is it that we actually have a problem with? Well, it seems to be we are unsettled by the idea of striking human targets offensively. And here, I think, is where the just war tradition comes in to help us. Because what we're talking about, I think, is discrimination and proportionality. So already you can see, we say use of drone, like we're using the drone. So we're already locating ourselves in the justice in war, the use in bello. So the framework is already helping us figure out exactly what we're talking about. Well, within the use in bello, we have concerns about proportionality and discrimination. And that seems to describe what's unsettling us about the drone or the killer robot. Is it going to kill the right person? Is it going to accidentally kill more people than it should? Okay, so this is helpful because we have something we can think about now, some principles to work with, proportionality and discrimination. All right, so I'm going to follow Statman again here. The idea is, yes, robots might fail to discriminate. They might get proportionality wrong. They might cause collateral damage. But the thing is, humans do this too. Human prudence doesn't guarantee perfect discrimination and perfect proportionality. Human decision makers are making those decisions in calculated ways that, given the best possible artificial intelligence, the robot can probably do better than we can. And that includes, I mean, if you think about it, if you're a human sensory technician and you're looking at the screen trying to identify a pattern that represents an enemy, you're just as prone to error as the robot, except if the most advanced artificial intelligence we have can probably do that better. So there's a sense that actually a drone or a killer robot is more ethical than a human decision maker because it's able, through its advanced artificial intelligence, to make those more precise discriminations. Okay, so like when I was in overseas, one of our enemies wore a particular garb, and it was, you could see it on the screen. Sometimes it was difficult to tell, but a properly prone robot would be able to do that. Okay, so yes, I think robots can err, but I think humans err too. And I think that ultimately robots will probably be able to calculate proportionality and discriminate better than we can. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my colleague, Paul Lashenko, who's doing doctoral work at Cornell and has recently written about this very thing, about a more just drone warfare. Okay, So let's move on then. What problems do we have then? What are the ethical concerns here? And I think that there's two, and we're really coming to the end of the talk here, so be interested in the conversation. There's a question about accountability. If we send out the killer robot, who's accountable when it does err? And this is where ethicists who are concerned about what they call in the loop, like where we insert the human being in the loop of the robot's decision making. And as I've just argued, we shouldn't be thinking about inserting the human in the loop because the human prudential judgment is somehow going to be better, but rather because some moral actor, some human actor needs to be responsible for the act. So this is where I think we have a lot of work to do. How are we going to construct a drone warfare where it's clear who's accountable? Now, if I get Statman right, he thinks that perhaps the killer robot, we can push the accountability to the state who deploys the robot. But my concern there is that anything pushed to the state is too vague. We won't be able to actually pin accountability on anybody. So I don't have the answer here. I'm interested in the audience's thoughts about this when we get to questions and answers, how we might determine who's accountable. Okay. And then here is what I think, for me personally, is the most serious concern. And that is that drones, it's not the drone itself, it's not the killer robot itself, but it's the targeted killing that it enables. Because I think that drone technology offers the possibility for a realist utilitarian calculation that short circuits use ad bellum. Okay, what do I mean? What I'm saying is that use ad bellum is a very rigorous framework for deciding that it's right to go to war. And it's that way deliberately because you want war to be your last resort. It is possible with a drone to strike a precise target and make a utilitarian calculation whereby killing this one target avoids war altogether. But I think that that's fundamentally an immoral option. And so what we have is the possibility of doing violent acts outside of a justified war context. And that is what I find really concerning. So it's not a use in bello problem that we should be concerned about. Rather, it's a use ad bellum problem that we should be concerned about. Okay. So, I would conclude the talk portion of this that by saying that for just acts of violence, I think that the recourse to the tradition's criteria for going to war, and that is taking violent action against an adversary, offers a sound framework for restraining the onset of violence and the suffering that it inevitably entails, regardless of who or how many suffer. And Cicero knew that it was important to treat all adversaries as guests, as I mentioned. And I think that we ought to see how, even armed with drones, we might do the same. So that concludes the presentation. I thank all of you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Major Lehman, much appreciated. We can take questions. You can send them to me, or if you'd like to ask them directly, you can feel free to raise your hand, and I will coordinate that process.
Jonathan, I might ask the first question, if I may.
Please, Dr. Kubler, feel free.
Major Lehman, as you were talking, it seemed like there was a reliance or leaning into of the process of binarizing, making the decision-making or the conditions one or the other, as opposed to recognizing maybe a continuum of challenge or ethical ethical risk or ethical challenge. Do you think that's a fair comment? And what is gained or lost in treating it as a black and white situation?
Yeah, it's tough because I risk undermining my whole argument here with an experience that I had. I was once strike director with authority to strike, and everything checked out. We had all of the the legal authority to do it, and all of our collateral damage calculations were good. Everything was good. And I was looking at the sensory feed, and I just had this intuitive sense that something wasn't right. And I ordered no strike, and the team didn't say anything. There was just silence in the room. But I think, Stephen, that kind of gets to your point that there was a human intuitive sense there. Now, I could have erred. There were plenty of people in the room who said, no, we have a solid science behind this that ensures that collateral damage will not occur. You can't just go off your own intuition. Maybe we lose something with that, or maybe I erred, I don't know. But the place for the eye of war, as Clausewitz talks about, just having the sense or the feel of it, does seem to get lost when we use robots. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Stephen Hall, I see your hand up. Please go ahead if you've got a question. Stephen, I think
Okay.
you're
Took me a while to unmute. So just a couple of points. One is one criticism may be that your decision to go to war may depend on what's at stake. And if you're using machines, artificial machines rather than humans, then you're much more likely, I think, to go to war if your only sacrifice is for some kind of machine, like your drone. So that's one point. The other point is regarding killer robots. It seems to me that at some point, when you have machine against human, machines are always going to be faster. Just a simple thing, if you have, two cowboys, one is a robot and one is a human, it seems to me that with the technology, the robot is always going to be designed to be faster. The human is always going to be slower. So you're going to be much more quick to turn your robots loose and take the human out of the loop, because the human is going to slow things down and more likely lose. So your comments on those points.
Yeah, thank you so much. For the first one, I couldn't agree with you more. You said Bellum questions, the decision to go to war should never be taken out of the hands of a human decision maker. Now, I can imagine in a science fiction scenario where we somehow have these robots who can make strategic calculations better than we can. But I just don't know if that would work, because ultimately, in the Army, we like to talk about war as the human domain, or the human domain in war, that war is a human enterprise. And even here at West Point, I teach English and philosophy, because I think both of these humanities are what give us insight into what war is and how we should go about it. So I couldn't agree with you more. Only humans should be making the decision about what, when, and why we go to war. To the latter point, yeah, I do. I think if the robot is better, then that's what we need to use, because we want to win. The war is, we go to war to win the peace, and we should, I think we ought to be as most efficient while being just that we can. But as I hope my argument has shown, that I think the use of a killer robot is just, because it's, it can theoretically discriminate and calculate proportions better, faster than a human can.
Thanks, Major Lehman. We have a question from Daniel Edens, who's sort of, I think, following your thinking about the use of the keeping of human agents in the ad valorem question, but at the other end of the process. So Daniel, if you want to ask your question, please go ahead. Daniel, you got working on unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Very good. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it didn't allow me to unmute. Yeah, so I'm really appreciating this, Joshua or Major Lehman. So I just had one question. You know, I'm sure, you know, being a commander of the Special Forces Group, you know, maybe sometime in your years of service, or you've either been on or, you know, heard tell of a group that, you know, or a detachment that has done a raid. You know, and but something, you know, with the killer robots, if they were to do a raid, you know, to destroy, you know, the enemy, would they have the capability of, you know, last minute surrender, you know? So, you know, that's something, you know, Delta forces or, you know, SF, you know, you're going in there and, you know, if they raise their hands and, you know, we surrender. I'm not sure, you know, if the robot will be able to recognize all of the surrender signs or white flags or, you know, in all the languages. And so what are your thoughts towards that? And I'll mute myself. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate the question. Thank you. I do have to say that, so I made that distinction between drones and killer robots. And drones is what we have now, you know, and it's an integrated system of an unmanned aerial vehicle plus the human team that surrounds it. When we talk about the killer robots, I do think we are in a theoretical thought experiment zone. So the idea is that in the far future, these artificial intelligence systems would be able to do everything that you're describing. They would be able to identify human postures that signal surrender, human language that signals surrender, to make those instantaneous judgments of discrimination. I shouldn't use the word judgment. I'll just say they'll make instantaneous discriminations based off the sophisticated, you know, artificial intelligence. So I don't mean that to sound like a Deus ex machina answer, but the idea is that if we can develop the artificial intelligence that can do these things, it can probably do it better than a human being.
Thank you.
Major Lehman, we have sort of 3 questions in the queue. So I know Ruben and Niall are, they've got hands and we'll get to them next, but I wanted to ask you a question from Lieutenant Colonel Lushenko, who is joining us and I think had to step away. Lieutenant Colonel, if you're still here, feel free to ask your question. Otherwise, I will ask it on your behalf. Paul writes, thanks, Josh. You mentioned accountability for drone strikes. Is it possible to differentiate accountability in terms of delegation, unilaterally approved strikes, and participation, multilaterally approved strikes, at least in terms of global politics? What are the implications for these distinctions for the public's perception of legitimacy, in your estimate? That seems like a pretty heavy question on my read, but
yeah, thank you, Paul, if you're out there. So Paul's my colleague. He works at Cornell and he does very sophisticated work on concerns of legitimacy and drone legitimacy, and that's what he's doing his research in. So I probably can't add more to what he's already studied on this question, but I have a sense that for the public, and again, this is just, I'm not sure that I have a philosophical answer for this one, but my sense is that anybody involved in the strike, whether as a delegated actor or a participant in any form, is still going to be understood as an accountable actor. Now, Paul puts it in the register of geopolitics. I'm not quite sure how I would think about that. Here, Statman's argument about the state being accountable might be the answer. We're not looking at individual actors, we're talking about states, and then how that plays out on the international stage. I don't know, but I'm sorry to disappoint Paul, but he could probably teach me on this one, I'm sure.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Ruben, you're up next in the queue here. If you want to unmute and ask your question, you're welcome.
Hey, Josh, it's retired Command Sergeant Major Ruben Arriaga. How's it going?
Hey, it's great to hear from you, Ruben. Thanks for joining.
Hey, I had 2 questions. I kind of look at this AI drone, this killer robot, kind of the same level as chemical warfare. You know, if you can unleash it in a huge area and it can just indiscriminately, well, not indiscriminately, but it can target lethal targets like soldiers carrying a rifle. But I kind of am worried about it possibly being used for like ethnic cleansing, like Saddam Hussein did to the Kurds, where he could just a large, powerful country can use these to do what I said, ethnic cleansing, or used in a different way than it would be for war. And then my second question is that we're in a race right now for AI against China, and it looks like it's either going to be us or them who have the first ability to make these. Is there anything that we need to be doing to stay ahead on that?
Thanks, Ruben. And like I said, I'm really happy that you could attend. The first question, I mean, I'll take the latter question first. I don't know because I don't know enough about the field of actual development and where and the policies that surround those questions. As an ethicist, I'm just not as well read on those. But I think your first question is a pressing one. And it's the same question that comes up with any development of any new weaponry of new power. So as we see this with nuclear weapons, right? We have the science to build them. The question becomes, ought we build them? Should we develop weapons that have, while they have extraordinary capability for achieving our military ends order to peace, also can be used for extraordinarily evil purposes, just like any tool? That question, that's a tough question. And I'm actually going to deal with this question with my students because I'm not sure that I have the answer on that. I'd like to imagine a world where prior to the development of nuclear weapons, we just said, no, we as humanity, we're not going to do this because the potential for it is just too evil. With nanotechnology and I'm thinking about swarms and the different AI systems that we have, I think that ship has sailed. Those technologies are existent and becoming more sophisticated. So I know that's not a satisfying answer, Ruben, but there it is.
Thanks. Neil Murphy, if you want to ask a question, please feel free.
Hello, sir. This is Cadet Murphy from one of your philosophy sections, actually. But I was just going to ask, what would you say is the extent or like the criterion with which you would allow AI to make decisions? Because we agreed earlier that we think there always must be a human component in deciding whether or not we go to war. And I would say there are definitely other limits that the AI has, such as like, judiciating or like administering justice upon people and stuff like that. So I was just going to ask you, what do you think the limit of that is? Or how do you think we should distinguish between what kinds of decisions AI is able to make?
Okay, interesting. If I get your question right now, and by the way, thanks for attending. So when we think about what drones do, it's fairly simple. They kill an enemy target. they destroy an enemy target. It's 1 or 0. But I think you're asking a question of, well, and I have already said that the use ad bellum questions should be reserved for humans because we're dealing with the complexity of human life and those types of things. You seem to be interested in an idea that could a robot do something else? Like, could a robot be a cop? Could a robot be a cop and make a decision about the justness of an action? I don't know about that. It strikes me as, I mean, justice is a fundamentally human thing, I think. It occurs in and among human beings. There's no, at least I think, there's no justice between animals or inanimate objects or robots. So I guess that might be a short way of saying no. I don't like the idea of robot judges. And that's why in one of the earlier questions, I struck the word judgment from the sentence that I made. I think they can discriminate. They can discriminate a target, what they should or should not shoot based off of the programming that we give them, or today drones based off of the collateral damage calculations and the sensory technicians interpreting things. So yes, please no robot judges.
Thanks. We have a queue of questions lined up, but I want to, and I promised Thomas Robertson, he's up next, but I actually want to pause and circle around to a question that my colleague John Miner had asked in the chat, which I think is relevant because it sounds like, Major Lehman, in your response, that you don't think that there's a possibility of moral agency on behalf of robots, nor animals, nor inanimate objects, right? That moral agency is something somehow exclusively human.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's interesting because John's question was science fiction oriented. He asks, are we trending towards an Ender's Game scenario or a Terminator Rise of the Machine scenario? And in each of those examples, it seems like this question of agency is what really differentiates science fiction from technological possibility right now. Does that make sense to you?
I think so. First of all, I'd like to say I love science fiction when I'm doing philosophy, because science fiction opens up the limits of thought, you know. Yeah, and I do hold for human beings as the only existent beings that have moral agency. Now, being a Thomist, I could add that angels, and we could talk about spiritual beings, but I think that for the purposes of this conversation, human beings have moral agency. And so when we think about moral actions, we need to be thinking about it in terms of moral, human thought.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for the response.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas, I promised you're up next. So please, if you want to ask your question, go for it.
Hello, thank you. I have 2 questions if there's time. First question, it's about Major Lehman's earlier discussion on the accountability for the hypothetical killer robot. And this question is, would it be possible for humanity to create something that it has no accountability for, or that eventually has no accountability for? So would there ever be a point at which unmanned aerial vehicles, especially as artificial programming grows closer to sentience, although we're not there yet, it's increasing towards that level, would this ever remove or reduce culpability from humans? And in what way? You mentioned you're a Thomist, right? So St. Thomas Aquinas' double effect. You have the intention, the action, and then the consequence. How do those balance out? And would any of those specific things be removed? Or that's a big question. So if you want to just answer that one, that's okay. But the second one is also, what defines an action in war to be proportionate? So drone warfare is an escalation in power, just like nuclear bombs, right? And they're mentioning they're tools, right? So they're not inherently good or evil. It's just the applications and the potential for each. But is there ever a line which is inappropriate level of force?
Yeah, good. Well, the latter question is I can answer that one pretty easily. Even in the military, we have escalation of force protocols where you start with the smallest weapon and then you ramp up. And the idea is just use the smallest weapon in order to cause the least amount of damage to the target. I mean, even so, for example, it's better to shoot for an infantryman to shoot another human being with a 5.56 round out of his M4 than with a tank round, right? You want to do the smallest amount of damage to end the effectiveness of that enemy soldier. So, I mean, that's just basically a ground level just war principle. We're trying to minimize suffering at every level, from the individual soldier that you're fighting all the way up to the nation that you're engaged with, or the nation state, or the non-state actor group, or whatever. We're trying to minimize human suffering and win the peace and be done. Okay, this earlier question, this is an interesting, again, science fiction type question, and you qualified it with the doctrine of double effect. So if I got you right, it's if we made a robot and we did not intend for it to go rogue, but it did go rogue, would we be accountable for it? That's what I think that you're trying to say. I don't know. My instinct says that somehow we're still ultimately accountable for it because we made the whole robot. I suppose if the robot has some sort of sentience that we were not responsible for making, then we would not be accountable for it. But I think that's a stretch, because I think artificial intelligence won't ever achieve what Thomas calls an intellectus, like the way that we know the world through our whole being. Artificial intelligence is just extremely sophisticated calculation ability. So whatever that robot does, I think we are responsible for it. Yeah.
Thanks. Stephen Dillingham, you're up next, but if you don't mind, I'd like to interject a question that I think is related here. As you were talking, Major Lehman, I was thinking a lot about distributed agency in complex systems. And you mentioned this in your thinking, but a lot of what you've said has gone back to the sort of accountability or responsibility of the human agent, whether it's the human team directing an autonomous drone strike, or that's the human team that's built the agential robot or whatever it is. But there are lots of theorists, including like Bruno Latour and Luciano Floridi and some other folks, who have talked about the ways that networks of agents or actors are distributed. So agency is distributed. And if agency is distributed, it therefore follows that responsibility is distributed too. And that's a point of concern for me, because if it takes a team to direct a drone strike, then it's the team's responsibility. It's hard to pin an action down on any one individual or any one robot for that matter. And I wondered if you could respond either as a Thomist or from a just war perspective on that accountability distribution.
Yeah, no, I think that's a couple of things come to mind. One, I think that's why Statman's argument about pushing accountability to the state suffers, because the distribution just kind of flattens out to nothing almost. But this is where I think military wisdom actually comes to play. We designate a commander and say this commander is responsible for everything that his unit does or fails to do. And I think that's wise, because it seems to understand that in war, there are many actors all engaged in the same enterprise. And any one of those actors may err, or you may have errors across the unit. So how are you going to assign that accountability? And so the military says there will be this one person who's responsible. And when you take the oath, you understand that. So I think that's one way that that's how I would approach it from basically just a military wisdom perspective.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting. It makes me think that the military hierarchy of leadership puts impressive moral burdens on the leadership as it goes higher up, if the leader is then accountable for the entire structure underneath them. Yeah, that's fascinating. Stephen Dillingham, you're up next, and thank you for your patience. Stephen, I don't know if you're there yet. We can't quite hear you.
I'll jump in with a quick question if I can, Jonathan.
Sure, Dr. Kubik, please.
And then hopefully Steve Dillingham's there for his question. I was thinking about the idea of accountability, Major Lehman, that you just described. And I've not served in the military, but I am aware from talking to people like you and others that members of the military have to follow orders, but are not supposed to follow an illegal order. All right. So if I've understood that correctly, do you think there is an imperative then in designing AI for your killer robot so that it is programmed to disobey illegal orders? Is that an imperative on the manufacturer?
That's interesting. I want to say yes, absolutely. And I think one of the questions when we talk about accountability is people, for the killer robot especially, philosophers will say, is it the program designer? Is it the artificial intelligence designer? And I do think, and it kind of goes back to one of these previous questions, the human mind who designed that algorithm and built it into the system does bear a responsibility for what the robot does. So yes, Stephen, I would think that yes, it needs to, that moral actor, that moral engineer, morally acting engineer has a responsibility to design an ethical algorithm. And there are quite a few philosophers. My colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Sheeman, next to our office, he deals with questions like this as well. So a lot of contemporary philosophy and artificial intelligence and drones is looking at that exact problem.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it seems you make the distinction, and there's a lot of sense in it, that the killer robot is potentially more ethical because it's less prone to make a mistake. But then following on that and your comments here, the corollary must be we are unethical to ever unleash an AI-driven killer robot until we are able to substantiate that it's been successfully programmed to refuse the illegal order. So we have a moral imperative before unleashing that technology. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I would also think that, when we unleash it, that is the order, right? Because it doesn't take any orders after that. It's programmed to do whatever we have ordered it to do. So at the origin of both its algorithms and its launch is an actor, a human actor.
Right. Thanks. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Dr. Kubik. Stephen, if you've got your mic worked out, Stephen Dillingham, feel free, and then we'll move to Stephen Hall, if not.
Well, my computer says it's worked out.
Ah, perfect. We can hear you now. Yep, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I guess my question is, with either drones or killer robots, how do our considerations change if we are fighting an opponent who, does not have the just war tradition and is fighting differently than we are? Sort of asymmetric warfare, ethically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, we just faced this right over the last couple of decades where we had a Western tradition engaged with an Islamic tradition of war, and they have different principles that they're operating by. I think simply we fight our way of war, which is the just war tradition. So if within our construct we justify the use of a drone or a killer robot, and the enemies or the adversary does not find that permissible, I don't think we're obligated to meet that other tradition's demands.
Thanks. I think that's a good answer.
Stephen Hall, you're up next.
Okay. You are probably familiar with the alpha dogfight trials that were set up by DARPA in August of 2020. I assume you are. And this was where different high-tech industries, defense industries, set up algorithms to compete against each other for an eventual drone type or virtual type of aircraft. And eventually, after they competed against each other, one would go against a real pilot who was flying a simulator. The fighter pilot, who was an experienced trainer, actually, a Top Gun trainer, lost all 5 battles against the virtual algorithms. So my question is, and I think you missed it my first time around, if in fact you find that by having a human in the loop, you are at a losing disadvantage, would you then not allow your killer device, your robot, to go rogue in order to win?
I'm hung up on the word rogue, because I wouldn't want to lose control of the robot. I want the robot to do exactly what I programmed it to do. But if I understand the question correctly, and given everything that I've said so far, I have no qualm with a well-crafted, well-designed killer robot that has the right artificial intelligence that I can just launch, and it goes, and it doesn't need any human in the loop, so to say. Talk about in the loop. There's no human in the loop, but we've met all these requirements that, like we've discussed with that Stephen has brought up. We've already met all these requirements for having the right design, the right ethical design. We have tested, and we have confidence that this killer robot is going to act ethically. Then I would do that. I wouldn't have any qualms with that, but I'd be concerned about it going rogue.
Thank you.
Daniel Edens, you had a question that you asked in the chat. If you want to unmute and ask that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I can bring it up. Major Lehman, Daniel asked in the chat, do you think that the Geneva Convention categories for war regarding combatants and treatment of enemies might have to change in order to keep up with the rise of drones and AI involvement in warfare?
You know, I confess I haven't thought about that question, so I'd probably have to think more about it and study the Geneva Conventions more in relation to drones. But my initial thought is, you know, a drone is a weapon, as I hope I've established in the argument, that it's a weapon. You can use it for good or ill. So to think that we might have to set up some type of something special in the Geneva Convention that addresses a soldier's rights with regards to a drone, I think that might be submitting to some of those earlier concerns that I raised in the argument about disrespect for humans and killing being unfair and not virtuous and those things, which as I said in the talk, I think that those arguments are easily refuted as really reducing down to pacifism. But you know, I don't know. I'd have to look more at the Geneva Convention and see if there's any relation there to the drones.
That's helpful. Thanks. Yeah, that's it seems like those international policy questions are complex. I actually had a question for you. You've got me thinking now about the context of just war theory and alternatives, potential alternatives. And so I wanted to ask you about Hobbes, basically. So when I think about Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes's view was that we live in a state of perpetual war, humanity. That's just the function, the nature of human beings. And that got me thinking, there's a lot of contemporary literature, especially post 9/11, post the Iraq War, about the idea of Americans in perpetual war, which is definitely not a just war theory approach, but rather an accounting of this social and political and economic reasons for continuation of war. And in that context, your accounting of drones as merely tools for good or bad that can be applied well in a just war context is different, right? It becomes problematic. And I wondered if you could maybe tell me where I'm missing the step, or where just war theory where the accounts of perpetual war fail? Because it seems like you want to hold the just war theory as the go-to.
Yeah, so I think this is really the question of realism. The first thing I'd say, Jonathan, is I'm concerned about the idea of perpetual war. Even when I was at the War College, there were a lot of theories that are out there that were beginning to emerge, that war never ends. You're always in a state of war. It's just a matter of where you're at on the spectrum. And these bother me because jus ad bellum seeks to bracket off and say, this is war, we're in war. And now we have a context whereby we can do violent acts that we wouldn't otherwise do as human beings. And it's justified. And then when that context ends, it does. And we can't just do violent acts anymore. So I think I'm bothered by these ideas of the perpetual war. But I would also say that, it raises the question of realism. So I think probably the strongest contender against just war comes from realism. But I think Thucydides dispensed with this one in the 5th century when he wrote the Melian dialogue. And he famously said that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And I think that is the bottom line of realism, and which I see as a fundamentally immoral position.
Thanks, I appreciate the response. We have a question from Abraham in the chat, which I'll ask on his behalf because he says he can't speak right now, but he says, he writes, for the US intervention in Syria, which includes drones, what does victory look like where there's no need for further military action?
Yeah, so I served in Syria, and it's been several years since I've been there. So at the time, the mission was to destroy the Islamic State. That was it, destroy the Islamic State. And we did that with the help of Syrians. In fact, they did most of the work. So it was a special operation and the Syrians did most of the work. I lost track of the question, I'm sorry. Oh, victory in Syria. So what does it look like? So there we go. That for the American war aim, it was to destroy the Islamic State. We did that. We met our war aim. So I think we achieved our aim at least. Maybe the following question you might ask then was, well, why are we still there? Or like, what is the purpose now? I don't know. I hesitate to get into those questions because I forgot to say at the very beginning of this whole conversation that everything I say is Josh Lehman speaking and not the Department of Defense, the Army, West Point, or any of that.
Yes, yeah, that's a good caveat. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Just to follow on Abraham's question, it struck me that part of what he was asking about was, we in Syria, the U.S. Army and military used drones in bello, and they continue to use drones post bellum, right? So there might be a really interesting discussion about the use of functionally the same technologies in these very different contexts before, in, and after wartime. So that might be something to talk us through a little bit, because I could imagine, the same sort of information gathering observational techniques that some drones would propagate could be used across all three of those domains.
No, that's a fascinating question. My initial thought is that it goes back to that idea about I am hesitant to allow a use post bellum argument to turn into a perpetual war argument, so that use post bellum actions can include war actions, because I think we need to be able to define the war when it starts. So use ad bellum, prior to that, we're not doing violent acts. We're not doing anything war. And then when the war terminates, however it terminates, we shift into a use post bellum. That should be a completely different operating environment, and it should not involve those acts that are traditionally violent acts in war. Otherwise, we're still in war. I mean, really. So I am against anything that brings a fuzziness to what we mean by war. But I mean, I have to add that that's a lot of theorists are, especially working in the realist tradition, are eager to do that. They're eager to do that because you know, if you're operating from a realist perspective, you want to do everything that you possibly can to always be in the winning position. So I'm concerned that that allows for immoral acts.
Yeah, thanks. That's a lot to think through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions from the audience? I have
Dr.
one.
I'll go ahead and do one more if I may.
Dr. Kibler, yeah, please help yourself.
Yeah, so I was thinking about artificial intelligence making its way into self-driving vehicles. And I think, Major Lehman, you mentioned that. We may have spoken about this before. And, you know, some of us look forward to, some of us abhor the day when maybe there's truly autonomous self-driving vehicles that handle all operations. But within that industry, people making sensors and vehicles and whatnot actually break up systems into 4 classes, where class 1 is, you know, what you have now, where you as the human drive the vehicle. The totally autonomous vehicle is class 4, and then class 2 and class 3 are those that are semi-autonomous, where you have sensors that aid or assist driving, and we actually have those in most modern vehicles. You know, if you go and you know, buy a contemporary vehicle, they often have lane assist, where they'll pull the steering wheel back if they see you're veering and whatnot. And so there's a whole other interesting conversation there about you know, how much we're being beta tested on the road to fully autonomous vehicles. In any case, there's an issue of the robustness of that stage 4 AI that's totally autonomous. There's already an issue of how robust are those assisted partially autonomous systems. And so I wonder if thinking along those lines with regard to self-driving vehicles, how does that inform our thinking about, you know, the killer robot scenario and the binarization of the technology? Do we in fact really need to have the same ethical conversations and considerations and maybe consternations about AI and drones, not just for the killer robot, but for systems you have now, where you can imagine there are, you know, targeting systems that will assist in the checklist. We already have advanced image recognition systems for targeting, but I can imagine very soon on the road to the hypothetical killer robot, you'll have systems that present you the checklist and say, come on, what are you waiting on, dummy? We've checked it. So don't we need to have that conversation now? Do we really need to bracket these things to the killer robot and everything else?
No, I think we should have these conversations now. It kind of goes back to Ruben's question earlier about the ought we develop these technologies, and the questions that surround that question are, how should we develop these technologies ethically? No, I absolutely think we should be considering all of those things, and you know, maybe we need not aim for the completely automated system. And, you know, I've mentioned several times now that there's many philosophers interested in the loop, you know, figuring out where the human works in the loop. And likely there is a place still in the loop, and not just at the on switch, at the launch point. Yeah, so that's a short answer to the question, but I think so. I mean, it's prudent, right? I think that's totally prudent.
Right, that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Kubu, that was an excellent segue into one of the last questions we've got for you, Major Lehman. Igor Kojadinovic had asked me a question. He says he's in a coffee shop and can't ask, so I'll read it to you. I think it's very much related to Dr. Kubler's concern. He worries that it might seem like the military is content to adopt a utilitarian stance on drone warfare. So he's asking you, how do you reconcile maybe collateral damage of innocence due to a lack of innovation? Is it on the grounds that a technology is still under development? Is that acceptable or even ethical? Or should we, I guess he's asking, should we wait until the technology is fully formed and maximally minimizing collateral damage before it's deployed?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can see it though working in two ways, because one, we already have the drones. We don't have the killer robots per se. In the case of the killer robots, yes, we should wait until we have this right. We shouldn't just make a robot and send it out there and hope that we get it right. But with the, I mean, it's true. It's been in the news quite a bit, actually, with the New York Times and collateral damage and some of the assessments that the Department of Defense had on collateral damage. It does happen. There's human error. I am not fully read on all of those particular ones, so I'll just speak generically. That most often, in fact, I can't think of any time where it's not the case, where to today, collateral damage is human error, whether or not it's an interpretation, a faulty interpretation of the sensor data, or if it is the intelligence work that leads up to the strike. Because remember, I mean, I didn't really mention the intelligence guys. They're a huge part of this whole process. The robot doesn't decide who the target is. The human team decides who the target is, and then tells the robot where to find it, right? Or the drone where to find it. I'm mixing my terms now. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. But yeah, I am concerned about collateral damage, and I think we should do everything possible to make sure that drones or killer robots are fully programmed to minimize that. Absolutely.
Thank you, Major Lehman. I might turn it back over to Dr. Kubler for some closing remarks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Major Lehman, for some absolutely fascinating insights on the ethics of drone warfare. And thank you, Dr. Beaver and Dr. Calkins, for moderating our event. And thank you, participants, for your outstanding questions. A link to this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view the recording again and share it with others. And there you can also find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in Ethically Speaking. So I'd like to give you a highlight of what's coming up. Hopefully you can see my screen, but I hope you will plan now to join us for our next event in Ethically Speaking. Climate change looms large as possibly the greatest challenge of the 21st century, yet many serious ethical questions arise when we consider the causes of climate change, the solutions, our shared responsibility for addressing the problem, and how climate change is altering our environment, economy, and social structures. And in our next event, Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray will speak to us about the role of emotions in facing climate change. Dr. Ray is professor and chair of environmental studies at Humboldt State University and author of several books on the subject. Her remote presentation will be streamed live, and you can register now for that by visiting the Center for Ethics website. So Ethically Speaking is made possible by generous support from many UCF colleges, departments, and units listed here. And I'd like to thank these partners and many individuals in those units who helped to bring this series to you. Our hosts and our presenter are going to leave now, but we're going to leave the session open, and Dr. Jonathan Beaver has kindly agreed to stick around in case we want to have any discussion among participants. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you again for joining us, and we really hope we'll see you again in future presentations in Ethically Speaking.